project, New Literacy, Multiliteracies, and Foreign Language from 2009 to 2015. Her recent research focuses on language and education, literacy, new literacy, multiliteracies, critical literacy, digital literacy, criticism and meaning construction, critical pedagogy, teacher training. Convido vocês a dar a bem-vinda para a professora Monte.
Sí. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. I'm not going to be daring enough to speak any word in Spanish, right? Because here in Brazil, as you know, we speak a kind of Spanish, right? This is what we call portuñol, you see, that because it's a mixture. But first of all, I thank you very much for the invitation. I was very, very pleased and very glad, for having been invited to talk to you all. It's always a very good opportunity for me to make people know what our research in Brazil is like, and also what I've been developing in terms of literacies and education in our universities and also in the national project, right? Thank you, Edson. You're very kind, for having invited me as well. And it's a pleasure to have you in my study group in Brazil. So I'm very thankful for this invitation and for the opportunity, right?
It's our pleasure.
Yeah, I feel also honored, okay, with this invitation. Okay. Do you think I should start my presentation already?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so yeah. let me share my PowerPoint with you. Okay, so this is it. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about foreign languages teaching in Brazil, about education, especially critical education in Brazil, and the new literacy studies, right? I also call your attention to the fact that first of all, we started talking about new literacy studies. We nowadays in Brazil adopt the term literacies only, understanding that literacies, encompasses the various areas of new literacies, critical literacies, visual literacies, digital literacies, and so on, right? So just understanding that literacies is to us an educational project that aims at, let's say, renovating education in Brazil and in various other places, such as in Colombia, because I've been in touch with the works developed by Raul Mora, and now by Edson as well, and also in another Colombian Brazilian group that has been, having meetings and discussing, let's say, partnerships. And so with this, I'm very glad that we've been partners, right, in these studies. So this is it. So I think I'm sharing with you now some ideas that I have for my talk this afternoon, right? So I thought of starting telling about the foreign languages teacher education, but situated in a very situated way. So this where here goes for Brazil, right? And of course that I would better respond about São Paulo, but because of the national project, I think that I have a broader view of what is also developed in other regions in the country, or in such a huge country, right? So with this, after this, I'm going to focus on the views of language, society, and the subject, right? Understanding that these views have a lot to do with critical education and critical literacies and the new project of literacies. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about Written Language Society and Digital Society, which is, well, part of the research that I've been developing as well. And then about the new literacy studies, but especially the literacy studies in Brazil, okay? So I'll start with the first topic, that is foreign languages, teacher education, especially here in Brazil. And I'll start telling you about some of the difficulties that have been raised by teachers whenever connected to foreign languages, right? But this survey was done longer ago. I would say, so probably in the very beginning of our national project, okay? So this is something that I identify to you, some of the difficulties that have been pointed out by our school teachers especially. I don't refer in this case to the university professors, but to school teachers. So some of the difficulties they've pointed out have been students don't know the verb to be very well. In Brazil, Brazil is famous for making students learn about the verb to be, as at the very start of a foreign language, for example. And in our, what we call our basic education, that refers to elementary level. So sometimes the students study this verb for 4 years because the teachers usually evaluate that they don't know it enough. So they go on repeating, okay, this kind of teaching. So another kind of complaint they have is that students don't know enough vocabulary to read. So whenever they have to develop reading skills, so this is the complaint. Another one is the students' pronunciation should improve. Students don't know how to pronounce well, right? And also, students don't learn English at school, actually. This is also, let's say, a concern that Brazilian schools are not efficient in terms of teaching English. So those who really want to learn English should pay for that at an institute, so at a languages institute, right? What has been also a problem in terms of social justice and so on. And students have difficulty to memorize. This is also another complaint. However, because of this kind of, let's say, findings that I had in my research quite a long time ago, how I could approach this kind of problem with teachers, especially school teachers, right? But then later I realized that I should also discuss this with academics, okay, with our colleagues at the university. So what I mean by this, pointing to the top of the tree, is a kind of didactic explanation that I developed to make to make this situation better to analyze, right? So I decided to tell them that all of the complaints and all of the registers they have in relation to their teaching a foreign language, in this case it was English, right, referred to something that I called the top of the tree. So they usually wanted to tell me something identified as the top of the tree. What I mean by that, they would never point out, or very rarely point out, problems related to the trunk of the tree or sometimes to the roots of the tree, right? So they would usually refer to something that was visible, just the same way that the top of a tree is visible even from a distance, right? But they are never related. I mean, some people don't even see the trunk, or the roots sometimes or many times are not visible. So they would be only pointing out what is visible to their eyes. So I first want to tell you that this the theory developed by Demirval Saviani, who is a very important Brazilian philosopher of education. To him, there is a great connection between methodology, philosophy of education, and pedagogy, right? However, usually teachers and that teacher education concentrate on methodology. So for a long, long time in Brazil, all the teacher education was, I'll say, concentrated on making teachers know about methods, for example. So grammar translation, so other lingual, the visual, and then communicative, or whether structuralist methodology or not. But anyway, communicative approach. So for a long time, all the teacher education in Brazil, especially related to English, was very much concentrated on this, right? So what I started discussing with those teachers then is that they were concentrated on what had visibility to them. That was the top of the tree. However, pedagogy and philosophy should always be connected. And they were very rarely told or taught about pedagogy, or that is education to us, right? And philosophy of education, what philosophy is embedded in such a methodology, for example. Then I developed this perspective called educational cultural linguistic perspective, right? Based on Saviani. So what is that? Here comes the tree again, right? It means that philosophy education that that is really the one where the methodology is embedded, that is not so much visible to people, is the one that tells us about a project of subject or people or citizens, right? And this is very important for them to understand. For example, when they decide that they are going to work a certain method, such as making students repeat, or drills, this idea, this method tells us about a fiction, that is, what society is embedded in this view, for example. The preparation for the pre-industrial or industrial society, for example, right? So again, I went on developing with them the idea, that they should all know a little bit more about pedagogy, such as which conceptions or thoughts or contents or orientations enable the education of people such and such in society such and such. Always having in mind that this practice, of course, this practice that is promoted to teachers and to students is a pedagogy and they should make all this connection to know that classroom practice in which they are asking which practices or approaches contribute to the education or to the training of people X, Y, Z, or societies X, Y, Z. They have a lot to do with the pedagogy and a philosophy of education, understanding that there is no practice that is separate. So at the same time, I was a bit kind of criticizing the usual training courses that were promoted again, among teachers, right? And training courses that would last 1 week or 2 weeks or sometimes a little longer, but just making them able to teach something without making them understand the context of education, the real context of education. So, a step or another stage of my research along the decades, right? That now related to the view of language society and the subject. and Written Language Society and Digital Society. Okay, so
Professor Walkyria, so sorry
yes.
for the interruption. We are having some issues with the connection, but if you want, you could turn off your camera and it is going to improve.
So let me know when I should go on.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Do you think I should review something that I've said?
No.
No,
We understood.
okay.
We understood. It was
Okay.
in a simple way. Yeah. Let's continue.
Okay. Is that okay? Can I go on or wait a little more?
Yeah. No. Let's continue in this moment, Professor.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So my assertion that it is important to understand this perspective, was based on various authors, various theories I had been, in touch. Okay. And for example, I bring Lyotard's assertion that to understand in modern times, one must be able to understand how society operates and why. Okay. And of course that I take into account this idea of modern times related to modernity, right? So for this reason, my question to students is, in which project of society do we live? Okay? So to make them think that we all live in a project of society. Many times they think that society is something as natural as nature, let's say. Something that they are born and they start living in certain groups or in social groups, right? And from this view, they think that society is the way it is. It was not socially constructed, for example, right? It was something natural. And there is a natural way in their lives that is, they grow a little more, they go to school, and after that, they have to find a job, and after that, many of them find a partner, they get married, get kids, and so on. You know this way as well. But I tell them that this is also a project of society that was thought to be like that, right? So going on, this is how I developed my research based on the idea that we all live in a written language society that it bases itself on how to make people read and write. So I show here the assertions by Levinson as well and mine. Okay, so what I mean by that? Okay, I mean that it's the feeling is that we were all born in a society, and it was already established that we should go to a school. Why that? Because at a certain moment of history, for example, modernity and the Enlightenment, for example, started showing ideas that found acceptance by many people. And this idea was raised especially on the idea that everybody should learn how to read and write. And this was, of course, after the invention of the written language, right? But anyway, just to make it short, this idea that everybody should learn how to read and write. This was a view of society. This teaching should be disseminated in the West. Okay, but to make this plan be well accomplished, they needed to simplify language. See, so this is very much based on Calantzis and Cope, but adapted by me because I expanded these ideas. So it means that although a country has different languages, for example, in Brazil, we don't have an only Portuguese or an only type of Portuguese, but there are different Portugueses, I would say, in different regions. But the Written Language Society has elected that we should follow a normativity that tells us that that is the right, correct language to be learned by everyone. Meaning that many times the other different languages are neglected, right? So also the meanings are standardized and homogenized, right? Meaning that students learn how to give meanings, right, in schools. And this the writing and written classes, of course, and also in literature. And whenever they have to develop their reading abilities, they are as well learning how to give meanings according to standards, right? So also to reinforce this idea, agreements are generated to raise official versions of standard languages. And there is a way of evaluation in order to guarantee that everybody learns about the same standard of language, just the normativity that is selected. So meanings and multimodalities, for example, have always been apart, right? Because the privilege was given to the written word, meaning that all the other languages that we have besides the written words were neglected by the idea of schooling. See, students would very rarely learn about the tones of a language, for example, and so on. Or images would not be studied, for example, in the schools. And this also would privilege the mind, right? Understanding that the idea of the rational, right? That we are all rationalized people, think, and the body is given no importance, okay? It doesn't matter, or it does matter, but the body is many times neglected or hidden, okay, in this process of their bodies, right? So such as Black bodies do not belong to this kind of privilege, okay, in the academic field, for example. Later on, we have Castells identifying that all this movement should also could also be called like the movement of the typographic mind development, right? Understanding that we all learned how to read and write following a system that went from the left to the right, and from the top to the bottom, a page after page, a line after line, for example. And that was very what the typography would do in publishing or publishing, I think, papers, right? Such as for magazines and newspapers, and even our works, okay, in the past, should all follow this typographic process, right? So this, because of this kind of project, we all developed typographic minds, understanding that we learned how to be linear, you see, how to follow sequences, for example, how to understand that everything starts from a very beginning, develops in the middle, and then finishes at the end. Understanding that all learning starts from what is easy and then goes to what is difficult, for example. So this is very much implicit, and this is what we call the epistemology that is implicit in the typographic mind as well, right? So in all, I identified that we all live very much based on this written language society. This is also what Alan Luke, for example, calls a print society, and there are other designations, okay, for this kind of society. And I like to call it written language to make this very clear that it has to do with the language and also reading, right? Based on modernist enlightenment project of society. However, what I've perceived in earlier times, not in earlier, let's say in later times now, very recently, is that there is a written language society living with a digital society. I don't mean that one eliminates the other or replaces the other, but they both live together, okay? There is conviviality, between the two lives. So this digital society, although has, let's say, problems, okay, I think to us, right? In terms of, I would say, coloniality, for example, digital coloniality. I'm not going to mention this now. If there is any interest, I can go back to this point. But digital society has lots of other advantages. The plurality of languages and cultures that had been neglected centuries, right? Meaning that, for example, multimodality had started being very much recognized, right? And it first happened in photographic technology and then with the digital. So I can go further, okay, about this as well, but later if there is any interest, but let me go back to this point. So digital society made it very clear that there's been growing differences in meanings with the emergence of diversity in the new global cosmopolis, for example. So we have always had differences in meanings. However, one meaning was elected as the correct one, kind of society. So what happens nowadays? We all live with the written language society that tells us what is correct, what is acceptable, what is supposed to be, done, right? But at the same time, we live with the differences, right? So there seems to be a certain conflict. However, it is a beneficial conflict in my idea because it gives the opportunity of expansion, right? This is the way I call it. So as well, divergences have been, for example, social language and globalized multilingualism. So they have been present, okay, having not very favorable, I would say, acceptance, right? Many people have denied divergences or divergences, for example, or at the same time. So more accessible media marked divergence or divergence in cultures and social languages. And of course that this divergences made well known due to the accessible media, right? Meaning that more people we started realizing that not everything that is accepted in Brazil is accepted in another culture, for example. But anyway, and multimodality, as I said, and then it shouldn't be only the mind to be privileged, but the mind, the body, and the habitat, okay, the environment. So this relationship was very important. And this would necessarily lead to differences, for example, because different bodies think, and different bodies in different habitats or environments as well, right? So all of this, this idea, this description was then called by Castells as the network mindset, right? Because then it means that we wouldn't only build up our meanings or our ways of thinking, okay, in a linear way, as if we had synapses way, but we could connect as in a network, right? So it didn't depend on linearity anymore. So I can tell you later more about this. So what I mean by this is society then started realizing the presence of technology. However, for example, I've been working in a technological school now, they say. And I would call their attention that they have always worked in a technological school. However, that one was an analogic, technology, right? Not a digital one, because the process of writing is a technology, right? So I was just discussing with them that we have always had technology, but to them, they would identify only the digital as technology and saying that technology doesn't affect me because I don't even have a computer. They would think that the very fact of having an equipment would make them belong to a digital world. And I would respond or explain that because the new communication and the new logics that we have in society nowadays have already been built following different network mind, for example, so that everybody would be affected by the digital, whether they had an equipment or a computer or not, right? Anyway, so this was a very interesting discussion in relation to this idea of society, okay? So again, I go to the view of society and epistemology. So I started realizing that we should probably work a little bit more on this idea of epistemology that refers to the construction of knowledge. So people had been very much used to the idea that knowledge is constructed the way that I have mentioned already, but let me review that we learn, for example, to study English, we should all start with the verb to be, okay, just to give an example. And then the second unit then would go to simple, present simple tense, for example. And then later on, they would learn the continuous tenses, for example, and present continuous tenses. Then they would probably study the past tense, the simple one, right? And then go to the continuous as well, right? So meaning that units would follow a certain linearity, and that would make very easy, or much easier, I should say, for teachers to identify the level of the students. So in Brazil, it was like a ruler, and the teachers would know that if you know up to 20 centimeters, you are a basic student. Then after 20 centimeters up to 60 centimeters, you were an intermediate, and then from 60 or 70 to 100, you are an advanced student, for example. That made it a lot easier for the teachers to evaluate, right? However, that also resembled the idea of the written language society that had been built by following this kind of logics, the logics of linearity, that what is easy comes first and what is difficult comes later. And people never knew who had defined what was easy, what was difficult, right? So that's why then I decided to design in my research this table to explain that the written language society is the one on the left, right? And was very much founded by the Enlightenment and the liberal positivistic or new liberal system. And I refer in this case to the roots of that tree that I showed in the beginning, right? For them to understand why they followed certain practices the way they did. So usually this is the identification Brazil followed for a long time, the Enlightenment, liberal positivistic and new liberal system, right? Of course that not all of them together. Nowadays, yes, all of them together, but not in the beginning. The history of education in Brazil tells us about people that could not go to schools, only to Europe for them to study, or they would pay for teachers to teach them home, such as homeschooling, right? so that they could have access to this written language society, as I said, right? Later on, then they opened schools, okay, and all the history tells us about this dissemination of how to read and write in Brazil. But there was a great influence from Europe, so we acknowledge that we have a Eurocentric, let's say, influence, right, in our curriculum, in our model of schools and model of schooling, right, in which paradigms, standards, and models have been reinforced or emphasized, right? So that this is how I include normativity, for example, the acceptance of a certain accent as the best in Brazil, and other accents are, usually ridiculed by other people. Also, we learned that there's been a one-size-fits-all perspective, one key to the universe view. This is also another way of calling it. Understanding that we learn how to make meanings, right? And meanings are accepted or not accepted. And this is very much controlled in the learning, in the ability of reading, okay? And during the time that students develop their reading abilities, okay? Another point that is also emphasized in this kind of society is objectification. So objectivity is very important. In a way, is to make students avoid subjectivity. Many students listen from their teachers that that kind of analysis is very subjective. They should be more objective, for example, because objectification is much more important, right? So by following this paradigms, one size fits all perspective, one key to the universe view, and this objectification. So one way of making this work or function or operate was by making use of reiteration, that is repetition, right? Because reiteration would, let's say, would provide or would make it able or make us able to maintain or preserve reality, society, culture, language, standard language, just the way it was expected, right? We should learn what reality is like and not accept different views, for example. And we would see this very often in our literature, for example, in the Brazilian literature, in the authors that wrote, our fictions and also our nonfiction. And I ask you to understand fiction and nonfiction between quotation marks, right? So what kind of technology is present here? I would say analogic technology, mechanic technology, especially because the kind of subject or student that they needed for society by that time was the one that was able to repeat well, to operate with machines in the pre-industrial and in the industrial periods, right, or history or times, okay? However, what we've been living with the digital now is sometimes conflictive, okay, to that, but at the same time, I think it complements, okay, and it expands perspectives to people. For example, nowadays, because of the digital epistemologies and technologies, we are very much more incentivized for critique and creativity, right? Because this society requires people to be more critical and creative. The system is a bit different, but this system has not erased the other one, the previous one, right? So what we are asked is to be flexible, to follow flexible paradigms. It seems that it sounds contradictory to say that paradigms are flexible, but I ask you to notice that I use flexible between inverted comma, right? Because it's the idea. It's we should understand paradigms in a different way, in a way that allows variability, in a way that varies, that allows ruptures. Okay, so standard ruptures. Okay, variable standards and ruptures. Okay, so this requires very much, right? For example, then we started talking about the digital turn, and we don't follow only the previous one size fits all, but we now follow digital epistemologies, and this has very much developed by Lang-Shui Noble in the studies about literacies. And the same we could say about objectification when Biesta, for example, raises the idea that subjectification has become very important now in these times, in the new between inverted comma right times. Sorry, no. Okay, so subjectification to him is when we start valuing the subject and the subjectivity, okay, of the students, not only their way of being objective, right, for an analysis, but subjectivity is very important. So now critique and creation and critique have been very important. So that allows also changes. So changes where in realities, in understanding that more realities or more different realities are possible or can be imagined. And society is the same to cultures, languages as social practices. So languages as social practices especially refers to the idea that normativity helps, but it doesn't encompass the differences or the linguistic differences and cultural differences. So the languages as social practices is the idea that tries or wants, okay, desires, I could probably say, respect for differences, right? And this is why I call it digital technologies that have raised digital epistemologies. What epistemology, how different are they? The first one, if you remember, I mentioned mechanic, analogic, that means linear, that comes from difficult to easy to difficult, for example. Now in digital epistemologies gives us challenges, right? We have sometimes to solve problems that we have never thought about them, and we have never told about them or heard about them, right? This is what makes some kids or some young people, when I mean young people, I mean of all ages, right? It doesn't mean only those that are up to a certain age. So that means they are able to solve, for example, video game without reading the instructions, without knowing the rules, you know. They are able to translanguage when they don't know exactly or what is the expected correct way of saying, of using a language, for example, and so on, right? So we now live with the two kinds of society at the same time. And learning how to live with all these differences becomes very important, right? So this is then when I go to my studies on new literacies, okay, and the literacies and critical literacies and so on. Okay. How do I base that? I go back to Calensis and Cope, okay, especially in their publication of 2008, right? This is the New Learning, okay, the book called New Learning. When they explain this in a very didactic way. So just let me follow them so that then I bring to what we've done in Brazil as well. So For example, they explain, they kind of divide, our historical moment into three different moments, okay, or periods, right? The first one is the one they identify as mimesis, right? The second, synthesis. And the third one is reflexivity. This is how they call it new learning, right? So the mimesis refers to a modern past. This is what I mean by the industrial and pre-industrial moment, right? Synthesis refers to the more recent times, when then we started having more new liberalism, I would say, in our society. And reflexivity, new learning, is now when we have all of them, when we have the pre-industrial, industrial, new liberal, and what is also called progressive, for example, ideas, or the ones that allow thinking different, for example, that allow the network mind, for example, and that allow the digital epistemologies, for example, right? So the reflexivity would be the author's proposal for a new kind of education, right? So I would say that we kind of follow this also in Brazil, but not exactly just the same way, right? We have a different history. However, what they explain in relation to mimesis, synthesis, and new learning is very useful, I think, for us to understand this idea of pedagogy, of this education that comes with literacies. Literacies, in our way, understanding as a project of education, a renovated project of education, right? So in the first moment, mimesis has to do with repetition. This is when the industries needed people to repeat well, right, to operate the machines. So these acquiring received knowledge such as facts, theories, literatures, and being able to repeat was very important, right? And this was really tested, whether they were correct or not, right? I think that some of you may identify this moment because it has not disappeared. We still have, for example, in Brazil, I don't know about in Colombia, but in Brazil, we still have it. We have all the three different moments at the same moment, at the same current period, right? So the second moment, synthesis, had to do with understanding as learners deconstruct and reconstruct knowledge and come up with the right answers on their own. This is very, very similar then to new learning, because in new learning, this would also be expected, the reconstruction of knowledge, and they are being able, for example, to solve a video game or to go on a different level of a video game, right, for example. However, this has to do with an individuality at the same time. So that is, you have to do it on your own, or their own here refers to the various subjects or various individuals, right? And the individuality is still very much present in this kind of synthesis, right? It has to do with almost like the, okay, how do I say that about the man that builds up his life based on himself, okay? That is this term that doesn't come up to my mind exactly now. But then new learning then would expect learners be able to move backwards and forwards between different things that, in this case, they can do, connecting with diverse learning experiences, reconnecting with the world in purposeful ways. So that requires much more from the young people, right? So these are the main ideas, okay, that we would see in the project of literacy. So the curriculum then, because following the specific correction of these moments, right, the curriculum will be built up on prescriptive courses, for example, outside knowledge, copied, reproduced inside the school. Maybe some of you, have this in mind also in your country, but in Brazil, we still see this, right? Although it refers to another period of history. Synthesis, for example, refers to broader range of choice according to relevance, needs, and diversity or diversity. The learner constructivism then, came to light, okay, in schools. Individual knower, what is external is taken to school at the same time. And not to be concentrating too much on the synthesis. So going to the new learning, alternative learning pathways have shown, okay? And curriculum that supports a society in which agency has been rebalanced. Auto-production of knowledge, ubiquitous education, where acknowledging that we learn anywhere and everywhere. It has always been like that. But then the idea is to acknowledge or to recognize that this possibility and to recognize that the learnings raised outside the school can be brought to schools as well, right? So, and the idea of agency, that I would say acknowledging that we are all agents because we live, we have actions. And this idea comes very much from identity. So just to finish this, right, to close, I mean, this idea of literacies, okay, the philosophy of education, now I go back to the roots, if you remember, right, the one that tells us which society and which individual or which subject, for example, in mimesis, we would see that the society of repetition, right? In synthesis, we would see the society of adaptation, initiative, and flexibility. Usually, for hiring young people, they would say you have to be adaptive, you have to have an initiative and be flexible, right? And this is what is called post-Fordism and Taylorism, right, in new liberal times. And now new learning that has to do with the digital society. So the subject is asked to be agent, creative, being able to work in groups and being collaborative, right? So these were different, I would say, abilities that should be worked during schooling, okay? So we see that it's not only based on content here in this idea of new learning, not only, right? So how do I see this? I see this as, in the first column, I would see this, the kind of abilities and the kind of views of language, right, and culture that would predominate in the written language society. We would see this idea of the uni, for example, right? The monolingual, for example, the idea of a one, for example, predominating, such as one size fits all. And this has to do with the various models, patterns, standards, predominance, homogeneity, and global views that would be present in our curriculums, in our education, in the way of teaching a foreign language, right? So added to that, because as I said, I don't think that this should be replaced. Added to that then, with the idea of a digital society, digital epistemologies, that the network mindset, for example, we started having the necessity of working with the multi, the variety, the plurality, the diversity or diversity, the opening, right? Opening views and heterogeneity and global local instead of just global. And creation became very important. And I would also add here critique, not only creation, okay? So what Okay, they are all related to the same table, okay, that I've designed, right, as I've said here already. But then a teacher education program should not only concentrate on the language, the knowledge of the language that should be taught, for example, in our case, Portuguese or English or Spanish or Italian or French, right? But this teacher education should be added of other notions and other practices as well. And they all are related to diversity or diversity, the views of subject here, in this case, meaning the person, right? The citizen, views of society, cultures of the others, and languages, right? Then the pluralizations would be implicit in these views, understanding that we would not abandon this idea of normativity and homogeneity, but also would add the notions of diversity and super diversity or super diversity, heterogeneity, hybridity, pluralism, difference, linguistic and cultural plurality, coloniality and decoloniality, plural identities. Oh, it's in Portuguese here, sorry, identidades, social antagonisms and power relations, okay? So a lot more has to be added in teacher education nowadays when this teacher has to be able to teach languages, right? It's not the language as just the way that it used to be when I studied, for example, when I was an undergraduate being prepared to become a teacher, right? So this idea of flexible paradigms and variable standards and ruptures have been very much emphasized in this national project in which we intend to develop, let's say, a more critical perspectives of society, a more, I would say, diverse idea of citizens, for example, citizens that can become more active, or that has to do with agency, for example, and how to work with flexible paradigms, variable standards, and ruptures, okay? This idea of rupture comes from the theories developed by Riquet, okay? Riquet has a great, I would say, study on hermeneutics, right? That is the construction of meanings, right? Or meaning making, as we say nowadays. And he has studied the idea that we all live what he calls circles, right? Interpretive circles, right? And if you wanted to develop new views, you have to rupture that specific circle in order to see a little bit further, okay? This is just an idea, but of course that we can develop more if that is of interest to you, right? But what do I mean by that? I'm going to explain. This is my view of digital technology and digital epistemology, and why it is so important, because it allows people who deal with it, okay, and who develop this learning with machines as well, to make changes, to interfere in something. This is the idea of critique and the idea of creation as well, right? So this is what we've seen in Brazil, sorry. For example, many people take an original picture, such as the Mona Lisa, right? And start making change with them, such as learning machine, right? So this is, for example, as they have made changes in this Mona Lisa in Rio de Janeiro, where it's usually very hot. And then she has had a haircut, for example, and she drinks água de coco, and she complains it's very hot, for example, right? So this is an interference, right? Technologically made by someone. But what is implicit in this intervention, for example? This person has challenged the idea of the sacred, right? And the idea of the sacred picture, right? And thinks that he's also able to interfere in something that usually was not advisable to be changed, right? So this is what we call agency, for example. This is also flexibility. This is adaptation. And it is what it is for good and for the evil anyway. There is no control over that. This is a problem. And this is also what leads to fake news, for example, and the other problems that technology brings as well, right? So, for example, another Mona Lisa, and this one is very fond of selfies, for example, right? So this intervention, we can notice the hand and the cell phone that was added to the picture. This one is also going through the pandemics, right? And is wearing masks, for example. This one, for example, has decided to favor the vaccination, right, movements that we've had in society as well. So we find a lot of interference, and this is very much technological. It happens in pictures, but it happens in texts as well. It happens in language as well, making the learners see how flexible languages are, right? And language, the idea of linguagem, for example, is, right? This is also called remix. I give two names here of researchers, right? Navas is in Penn State, and Moura is a Brazilian. He's taken a postdoc program under my supervision at the moment. He's excellent in this idea of technology and everything related to this. Okay, so this is the idea, but the problem is how do we propose something in terms of foreign languages, right? I'm coming to an end, I think. Oh my goodness, speaking too much. Should I stop here, or can I?
No, Professor. No, Professor. You could take your time. Don't worry.
Can I take?
Yeah. Let's continue.
Minutes more.
No,
okay.
No. Don't worry. Take your time.
Okay. So my idea is to think of a proposal, for example, right, in terms of foreign languages at teacher education, right? So what is this idea? This is why we've been making use of the concept of literacies and critical literacies in Brazil. To us, critical literacies comes very much from Freire, right? And this has been very much admitted by Alan Luke, for example, and many of the other researchers that belong to the New London Group, for example, right? I think Freire had a great influence on them, and that's why we feel so familiar, I think, and so comfortable to make use of critical literacies and literacies, but not thinking that we are importing ideas, right? But we are developing and expanding ideas with our foreign colleagues, right? But the ideas are all Brazilians as well, right? So three axes, I think, would help us work for different teacher education program, right? So one is related to knowledge construction that has to do with epistemology, right? The other one is critique, critical education of citizens, right? And another one is refers to meaning making, that it has to do with hermeneutics. However, the hermeneutics, for example, that comes from Paul Ricoeur, that is called the critical hermeneutics, okay? So in each of these aids, I would see various other topics, okay, being part of teacher education, such as conventional epistemology, non-conventional epistemologies, ontological and epistemological relationships, for example, that have to do with the place. The onto has to do with the place and the people relationship in a certain space, I should probably say, and also the knowledge construction, okay? Objectivity, subjectivity altogether, mind-body-habitat relationship, right? In critical education of citizens, I would see the importance of developing which project of society do you think you live, for example, which project of subject do you think you've had and you think that you promote, right? And which concept of language, culture, habitat, okay, is implicit, right, in these views, right? So in meaning making, then representation reality is also very important to be discussed and to study with the teachers to be. Understanding how the world is described versus perceiving how the world shows. This comes from Günter Grass, right? When he tells us that we all learn very much to understand how the world is described, and we learn how to follow this description, thinking that this is the way the world is, right? However, we should all also develop this perception that the world shows in a certain way, and that we can probably describe it differently. This has to do with diversity, for example, the different cultures, different, genders, well, all differences, I would say. And the human relations, in this case, understanding that there's a vertical hierarchy, but a horizontal hierarchy in the same way. So what is meant by that is hierarchy is present in society, but there is one kind that allows negotiation, that is the horizontal hierarchy. So that is the flexibility between, for example, teacher-student. This is also what Freire would say, that teachers also learn and learners also teach, you see? Understanding that everyone brings knowledge, right? And that will then require a different kind of relationship and a different meaning making of the human relations, okay? So in terms of profession then, I should show 4 strands, right? See, 4 strands, okay, to think of. One is teaching policies, another one is language policies, right? Teaching policies would then require knowledge construction and views of society. Language policies should encompass views of language, linguistic knowledge, and methodological knowledge. Why do I use inverted comma, for example, in methodological in this case? Just to remind people of our views that methodology is something that can be built up by teachers, right? We don't need to inherit or to import methodologies, okay, that come pre-established to our places. So methodological knowledge brings the idea that, of course, we can know and should know about methodologies, but we can also create new ones. This is very true, for example, for research. You see, how can we do research about digital epistemologies, for example, or about digital, following the same research methodology that we used for another view of society, another view of language, for example, right? So we can design and devise new methodologies. That's why methodologies between inverted comma, methodology would reflect very much the top of the tree that I started my talk here today telling you about, right? But then if we go through that process, that it's not only the top of the tree, but the trunk and the roots, we can probably have a holistic view of education and probably start rethinking, our practice and our purposes as well. And the number 3 and number 4 refer to language, culture, society relationship, understanding pluralities, diversities, difference, active citizenship and agency, for example, and the critical perspectives or critical education that refer to meaning-making, critical literacies, linearity and non-linearity as well, as part of epistemology, okay? So these are some of the views that we have. And just to close, other epistemologies in schools and diversities, for example, will refer to cultural practices, not only those of the formal schools, universities. This is foods on unequal opportunities to learn. Is that focus? Okay, sorry, I couldn't read that word because of my light here. So rethinking dominant cultures and ideologies, rethinking colonizing knowledges, scientific thought, Eurocentrism, globalization, Enlightenment values, for example. This is also all following the sociological imagination. And I gave here, a definition of what I meant by that, right? Then other epistemologies going on would be generating ways to disrupt. Disrupt is the verb that relates to developing critique, okay? Disrupt the interpretive circle, what is nowadays also called the bubbles, right? In the digital world. Right? And at the same time, live with hegemonic power. The idea is not to eliminate the written language society, for example, what is hegemonic, understanding that there is a place for something and there is a place for another one. What is hegemonic can change, right? We should question this idea of hegemony. How could that probably work? By thinking otherwise, by promoting this idea that we should act otherwise and develop meaning makings. Other ones different from the ones that we've learned as given already, right? So these are some of the ideas related to literacies, critical literacies, and teaching of languages and teacher education nowadays in our project. So with these ideas, we have been working with around 30 other universities all over Brazil, right? So now I would love to know what you think about all this, right? And I would be very much open, right, to see and to listen to you, and also to respond to questions if that is the case. So this is my last, and I think I have to go through it anymore. This is the status of new literacies, multiliteracies, critical literacies, investigate the relationship between content and abilities. I'd like you to notice that I use and not or, okay? So there is, everything that is put on the left here should not be eliminated, but should be expanded. This is the idea. Structures, such as linguistic structures, but also communication, such as digital communication, critical reading and critical literacies, reading and literature, language and culture, foreign additional languages and education, curriculum design and policies, for example, right? Okay, this is just an example of something that I did with the students for you to understand. I worked with this experience. I had this experience with graduate students, right? I was teaching social linguistics, and I wanted them to see the critique in the use of RP English, British English, and Black English, for example, and I mean the different kinds, okay, or the different Englishes, right? So the idea was to analyze the movie Star Wars Episode 1, right? In which there are different communities, one that is represented by RP English, the one that is related to monarchy. Another one that it relates to Black English, right? The ones that live under the water, for example, if you remember. And the other kinds of English in between, right? So making them see how this is usually constructed, socially constructed, and the varieties, and whether it is fair and unfair to give different treatments to them or not, right? Anyway, and just to close, this is one of my favorite, I would say, humor, right? That is when the spiders meet. And this one says, I've broken the model. And the other one says, but you haven't replaced it. Right? That's the idea. So yeah, we are going to break models, but we want to replace them completely, right? So thank you very much. Let's see now if I can also listen to you, okay? Thank you.
Thanks to you, Professor. It was brilliant. Obviously, we could rethink a lot about your interesting presentation, also with a kind of humor. And it's very interesting because not all the things need to be as formal as we think.
Oh, I forgot to tell people that I'm not formal. Oh, but now they have realized it already, right?
Yeah. And we noticed. We noticed. We noticed. Don't worry. You don't need to use your words for expressing.
Yeah.
Professor, no, it was so brilliant to reflect about this disruption idea, this digital concept, also the way you value those paradigms and traditions for taking into consideration for the advances for today. Now it's brilliant because we are using the old as an organic way, all as something that we need to our teaching practices and our learning practices. And even with your speaking, we analyze that language is not just the linguistic field, it's also the culture, it's also the ideology, the system power, and that is so interesting. One more time, thank you so much for sharing with us this interesting reflection. Is the time for questions and discussions here. So I don't know if some of you, the participants.
Yeah, Jose Vicente has his
okay,
has
right. Yeah.
Jose.
I hope I can respond to all of them.
No, I thank you to all of you. Thank you to Oscar, to Edison for bringing Professor Monte. It was a fantastic talk with a lot of elements for us to think about. I don't think it's necessarily a question. I think it's more about engaging in conversation and reflection about what you said. I was thinking when you were discussing the paradigms and the paradigm shifts, there were certain times when you mentioned elements that to me are very interesting. You mentioned
elements of?
My microphone is off?
No. Elements of, I missed the word.
Oh, okay, no. What I was saying is you mentioned at some point that in Brazil, those paradigms were coexisting. And I think that's very powerful, because I think one of the dangers that we have had in English teaching or in languages teaching is this idea of the perfect method. And so there is this notion or this idea of thinking whatever is new is the right thing, and we have to discard whatever we had in the past. But you were saying, you know what, is not that we're having this or that, is we're having all of those elements at the same time.
That's
And
right.
for me, that's fascinating and it's very important. For example, in my case, I teach academic writing. And sometimes when I approach literacies, there seems to be this initial idea that you have to disregard or forget about structures or discourses and focus exclusively on practices. But I think there is a certain danger in that. But I think at the same time, it's fantastic to move into this paradigm of hybridization. So we understand that all of these realities are coexisting. And I want to show that with an example. Now, because of the pandemic, we were forced to use this digital, virtual, distant education.
That's right.
And we had, and we still have, students who struggle because they don't have access to internet, because they lack connectivity, because they don't have the devices, the computer. And I still have students who struggle with that. But paradoxically, now that we're starting to think about the end of the pandemic and going back to the university, we have students that say, we don't want to go back to the same. And, we got used to using Zoom and using online education. And I'm thinking, oh my God, now we have transitions coming from both sides. People who don't want to go back to what we had, people who are still struggling with adjusting to online education. And I'm thinking we just need to learn that is not one or the other. We're going to have to come up with something completely new. But do you have any thoughts on this?
I do. I've been discussing this in some of my talks. We cannot go back to the way that we used to be. It's not only to teach but to be. Much before, I think in May, much before, not only in May, I discussed this issue with other colleagues, saying, why do students have to go to university every day, and then they almost have to be controlled? Their presence has to be controlled. Frequency in Brazil, I don't know if you have this in Colombia, but frequency is important. The students almost have to sign that they are there, right? There is not much flexibility. And I said, hey, this is so school-like, because students should, have some time for them to study home. And maybe we should have classes just for discussions, right? They don't have to come to university every day. We don't have to control them. They have to learn how to be agents, okay, and responsible. And many people still find it very difficult, right? But anyway, this is, I don't have anything precise now, but I would say that there is a tendency for me to change, right? And I've changed it a little bit, but I think that we can even change a little more in relation to rethinking our structures. You see, many students loved being able to come to a class online, right? And some of them come from other states in Brazil. Imagine the size of the country, and they don't have to take a plane to come to a graduate course, for example. You see, that is fantastic, right? You see, even some people from other countries can also participate, right? So that's really wonderful. So also in terms of structures as a whole, right? I would say not only for presential classes, for example, but for content, I always think of that, why this content and not another, or why don't we give more emphasis to abilities rather than content, for example? Once I heard a student say, I didn't come to class. I don't like the teacher is usually telling me things that I can find online, or I can read the book. you see? And I found that interesting to think about, right? It was a good reflection. Anyway, we have to change. This is the main reflection that we have nowadays. Don't you think so?
Yes, that's true. And
You know, even let me just complement something. Even in the written process, right? I mean, in the academic writing, right? We've been allowing our PhD students and master's degree students to write in a different way. For example, when I was a PhD student, I wanted to add pictures to my dissertation, and I was not allowed. You say, no decoration. I said, it's not decoration, you know. It's images. It's a serious study, but nobody allowed me to make use of images over there. And we now incentivize people to make use of images, because images are part of now visual literacy, right? Literacies, and so on. And also, the development of the academic writing has changed it to us. So we've been more creative, right? Been allowing the students to be more creative in their elaboration.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, thank you. I was just going to say that you're right, that we have to change. Hopefully, we can take the time to reflect. So those are more informed changes and decisions rather than just responding to the juncture, to the spur of the moment. So it is important to have this spaces for dialogue and conversation and reflection. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Interesting issues, right?
Thank you, Professor Jose, for your participation, and also Professor Walkyria for your excellent answer. Also, something that calls our attention was that phrase where you talk, teachers also learned and learners also teach. That calls our attention a lot. I don't know, maybe if someone has any question, you could make the question here, or in the contrary, we really like if you expand a little while this concept that calls our attention a lot.
Is there any question, or should I start? Can I start?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So this has to do with the Freudian concept of dialogism or dialectics, right? So I've been very much interested in seeing the approach or the approximation, maybe I should say, between Freire and the studies on decoloniality, right? So I don't know if you followed one of my talks, I mean, this week or last week, because we've been celebrating Freire's 100th anniversary, right?
Yes.
So I've been given a focus on that. And one of the approximations, I would say, or proximities that I see between Freire and the studies on decoloniality is the idea of dialogism, right? Understanding. Freire would say that that tendency for teachers to think that they should know everything and students are, the ones who don't know, for example, right? And he was one person that made us reflect that usually students bring a lot of knowledge, right, to schools, right? So they teach us a lot of things. They can teach us a lot of things if we make them make use of their agencies and their voices. For example, someone make use of voices is also another problematic term, okay, even in Portuguese. But anyway, because students can teach a lot to us as well, right? And teachers are not the ones who only teach, but they should learn, right? So this is the dialogism that he sees in this relationship, understanding that we should not you know, follow the arrogant way of having a relationship with the students, right? Because the students also know, and now that we all deal with the digital, students certainly know a lot, you know, about the digital and teach us a lot. This is a very simple example, but you know, we've learned very much, I think, with the students, you know, students from different regions, from different contexts. You mentioned São Paulo is a huge city, right? More than 10 million inhabitants. And many of them come from different states, and some of them come from a different, they are immigrants, right? So we have a lot to learn from them as well, right? If we listen to them. Sometimes, let's say in our old times in our university, teachers would never listen to students, for example. I mean, USP, the University of São Paulo, right? Some teachers would teach on a certain stage, right? And students would listen to him or her, right? From the audience, and they would listen, follow everything quietly. So they should raise hands in case they had something to ask, for example. So there was not a participation. There was not something that was lively, you know, over there. And this was one of the concerns that Freire had, that we should work much more on the idea of arrogance and make our, should be humble. We should be more humble. That is, to listen to students, to have a different relationship, right? So this is very much the idea of dialogism. And I think I see this view in the studies on decoloniality, right? When we also say that, hey, teacher is not the one who knows everything, but he's the one that manages, you know, knowledge, right? And allows or promotes, you know, ways for the students to learn more. This is also another role that teachers have, very different from the old convention, right, for teacher education. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we could conclude, Professor, or not conclude, for adding to this interesting discussion that those paradigms that we already faced, for example, today, we could, or better, we as language teachers, for going beyond that linguistic issue or that linguistic field, we could involve, or how could we involve those multicultural, that plurality, that diversity, because that is a challenge. Mm-hmm. Yes, because even when the institutions or a lot of institutions just pay attention on the linguistic field. Mm-hmm. Yes, and even when we are here, in some cases, if you are not a native speaker, maybe it's a kind of difficult that people accept you as an English teacher. Yes, it is not a general, imaginary. We know that in this moment, with these decolonial perspectives, we are working on showing a different perspective, but how to engage our students, for example, language or preserve English teachers, not just for thinking in the linguistic field, but also in those other interesting aspects that are important for our field.
I think one way of doing it was making them rethink views, right? If they follow, for example, in a certain way, we have to tell them a little bit about colonization, right? Or coloniality, okay? For example, making them understand that, for example, in the past, it was like that in Brazil. And even nowadays, we still have people who believe that a native speaker is a better teacher because he's a native speaker, right? But for example, in one of our classes, we take videos, short videos of people who are native speakers and they come from different regions, and they don't follow any standard, right? They don't follow the normativity of the English language, although they are native, right? So, and make students think of that. So what is the native speaker, okay, that you're looking for, right? Because there are many kinds of native speakers, even in Brazil. Just look at that. You think that everybody speaks good Portuguese. What is called good Portuguese? Because everybody speaks good Portuguese according to their community, right? But we have to make them know that there is a choice, okay, in society, in this view of society that I call the written language society. The normativity was elected as the one to be followed. But as it was elected, the one to be followed, it neglected and this even despised the different Portugueses that we have, for example, right? So this is important. So it's not only knowing the language, but knowing all the system that made us make use of a certain language, right? So little by little, we should promote this critical view, right, among our students, right? Of course, that there are those that are never going to change their minds because what they like is native speakerism anyway, right? But we should always be aware that this is important. So it's a whole big, you know, kind of practice, okay, to be engaged, right?
Thank you, Professor. We have Andres, one question from Andres Roman. Yeah, Andres, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, good afternoon, teacher Edison.
Good
Good afternoon.
Thank you. My question is about the fact that, for example, you were giving us the example of Brazil that have it has a lot of cases of immigration. I mean, the immigration in Brazil has been huge. And in Sao Paulo, for example, a city of millions of people, like more than 10,000 people, the population there. So my question is about the fact that
more than 10 million.
More than 10 million people is a lot of people. So my question is about, for example, the fact that you have, for example, in a class, maybe you might have students from different like countries or even other states of Brazil. So how do you, how do we as teachers, for example, in a case where we have cases of people from different places of the world, how do we engage them into our culture? So what are those strategies that we should design in order to engage these people to be aware of the context they're living in? Because they come from different contexts.
Yeah, this is very important for them. But one notion that we find important, okay, to work with the students, right, in a certain sense, I mean, in teacher education especially, is to make them think about this idea of a nation state, right? That is the one that shows a kind of a triangle that should be that should give the standards for different places, right? But this is a theory, this is a notion, okay? Such as territory, language, identity, right? So if you were born in a territory, right, you should have that language specific to that territory, for example, Brazil, right? If you're born in Brazil, you should speak Portuguese and your identity is of a Brazilian. There is a certain design saying that there is a Brazilian type, right? Usually the Brazilian type is the one who enjoys football, churrasco, right? Samba, okay, this is the stereotype of the Brazilian. However, it's important to discuss with teachers that this is a notion, and this notion was the dominant one in the world, right? Until we started having globalization that made it shake a bit, right? But if we follow this, we just follow without thinking or rethinking this idea, we're always going to look for the ideal Brazilian or the ideal language, for example, of Portuguese, when there are so many kinds of Portuguese, or so many Portugueses all over the place, right? And Portuguese that are now a hybrid of other immigrants' languages, right? So it's much more expensive. It's much more beautiful to see the differences and to learn how to appreciate the differences, right? Than just considering a standard, right? You see, we have to do this with the teaching of a language. This kind of notion has to be promoted, right? And discussed with the students at the same time. I don't know if I answer you, but it's quite a job, that we must do. I've been doing this for decades, and I still see students that love native speakers, for example. Nothing against the native speakers, I have to say, right? But the idea is, when I'm a teacher, I have to consider differences, right?
Yeah, you totally answered my question. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Professor Walkyria, just for finishing, if we don't have more questions.
No, Professor Castellón, Maria Fernanda also raised her hand.
Okay, perfect.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Maria Fernanda, it's your turn.
Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, Professor Walkyria, for your talk. I did have a question related to the interpretive circles in the digital world that you mentioned about them as, you talked to them about as bubbles. Now, I find that concept interesting because a bubble is closed to the outside world. So I was wondering, what does that concept of a bubble mean, and how can we ensure that that interpretive circle is connected with the reality that it is trying to understand and not close to it? So.
Very interesting. I have a great interest in this kind of study, right? Interpretation in the hermeneutic area. Let's imagine something like this. I was born in a small city in Brazil, right? In a middle-class family, right? I go to school and I study in the same classroom. I usually studied in public schools in Brazil. And in the same classroom, I had a classmate that came from a different community from mine. That is, for example, farther, he lives or she lives farther than I do. Okay, my home is about 1 kilometer from that school, and his or her home is about 3 kilometers in a different community, right? And their parents, his or her parents had a different kind of education and different kind of social relationship, right? So I have probably built an interpretive circle in my community. And that colleague of mine has probably built a different interpretive circle in his or her community, right? So let me say, for example, in my culture, my family used to be conventional, that everybody was born in by 5, 6 years old, we would go to school and we would teach, and we had to be excellent students and such and such and such. But in some other communities, they didn't want the kids to study so much because they needed even the younger kids, to work in order to buy food for the whole family. You see, so they build up their communities and their bubbles in a different way, right? For example, I observed some kids playing video games, right? And during the game, The Sims, I don't know if you feel familiar with it, The Sims, yeah, you do. They were all anxious, to buy things for the house. I mean, a group of students, they were about the same interpretive circle, right? And I said, but why do you want to buy so many appliances to your home? And she said, I've been able to buy 2 dishwashers, right? No, washing machines. And I said, what, you have a big family? Or why do you need 2 washing machines? And she said, I don't care, but I could do this. I could buy them, for example. You see, buying is more important than reflecting about other needs. They don't even have to think about that. They just need the object, for example, right? Maybe in another circle, they would not do the same. They would probably play the Sims differently, for example, right? So this is what I mean. It seems that we in the planet have followed the same interpretive circles, but it is not like that, right? So there are different interpretive circles. Sometimes some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, but we all live in these circles. And these circles are the ones that make us think and view things the way that we do, right? I don't know if I answer it, but this is a very, do I?
Yes, it's just, and do you think that those bubbles can be burst, can be broken?
Yeah, I do think so. It's hard, you know. Yeah. It seems the bubbles are made of a different plastic, I think, you know. But yeah, but I think so. And this is what I mean by being critical, right? Being critical is imagine that you have a pin and you are able to put it on the bubble, and then you just rupture the bubble, right? This is when all of a sudden somebody tells me something that I had never thought. It changed my mind completely. Let me give an example. Brazil is large, as you probably know. Once I was traveling in the northeast of Brazil, in some cities, those cities beautiful, marvelous, you know, excellent to go. But we find very poor regions as well. And you know what I saw? I saw a bride at a bus stop alone, waiting for a bus to get married. You know, I saw this scene, and I'll never forget that, because that was so different to me, because I was used to the idea, see how bourgeois, you know, I was so used to the idea that brides usually come in a car, right? They take a car to come to, they are taken to church in a car by someone, right? And they can wear their special clothes, right? But there is usually a ceremony, but I had never seen a poor bride, you know, alone at a bus stop waiting for a bus to get married, right? Of course, that this for me sounded like a rupture, because it said, Walkyria, you see how bourgeois you are. You think that everybody gets married just the same way, you know? People do things differently. So that was so important to me. That kind of view was so important to me, because it made me think about myself, right? About my interpretive circle, right? So maybe this is an example that makes it clearer for you to see that how rapture happens, okay? So that opens up my mind when some rupture happens like this, right?
Thank you so much for that participation. We have another question that is from, hello.
Excuse me. Yeah, we have, I take notes here. We have Henry and then Professor Mora. That will be the two last interventions.
Mora, how?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're there. Thank you.
So yeah, Henry Jones and then Professor Mora. Okay.
Henry.
Hi, 1 second. Just
okay, perfect.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Hope you're all doing very well. Thank you very much. Hi there. That was very interesting. Thank you very much. You touched upon one of my pet subjects, which is Englishes, non-standard Englishes, different variations on English, and the history which has created these different variations of the languages. You also talked about Portuguese. Fascinating stuff. Over the years, so a little bit of background. I'm a philosophy graduate, and I've been teaching English and designing course materials for a long time. And I've made several things over the years about non-standard Englishes, about Indian English, and about lessons based on articles, just about different ways English can be spoken. And when I'm correcting my students in the classroom, when they say things which are kind of non-standard, when they miss the verb to be, etc., and I correct them, I do also point out that there's a lot of African Americans that do speak like that. If they say like tink instead of think, I point out that people in Ireland would speak like that. So I try to suggest how maybe standard English sounds as well as other versions sound. But I have one particular anecdote, something that's played on my mind for a while. I teach a lot of exam courses like TOEFL and IELTS. And essentially my question is this, but I'll fill this out with a bit of an anecdote as well. Considering, the rich subject that are non-standard variations of languages and how, natives don't necessarily have to be the model, which, great ththings to talk about and promote. Do you think that there's a tension between that concept and international standardized exams? Because I'll give you, an interesting example. Happened to me a few years ago. I had a student from the island of San Andres, which is an island off Colombia. And he explained to the class that he is actually trilingual. He speaks Spanish, Creole, and English. He's a native speaker, right? And he came to me at the end of one of the classes and asked me how he could improve his pronunciation for the exam. So I gave him a very sort of sensitive answer of like, there's nothing wrong with your pronunciation. It's different to mine, obviously, but it's fine how you speak. But honestly, during the course, he was quite difficult to understand a lot of the time. And I'm someone that, I think I like to be quite open-minded about these things. And I consume media and music and stuff from all over the place. But the guy's writing was poor, by the criteria of the exam. And his English, his spoken English was quite difficult to understand sometimes. So I found myself in this position where as a general English teacher or as a linguist or a philosopher, I was like, great, you speak differently to me and that's cool. But as someone preparing someone to study abroad and to pass a standardized exam, I was, I had to necessarily, in inverted commas, correct him and change the way he spoke or help him do that. So, it's something that's been on my mind for a few years. I find it an interesting thing to think about. So I guess my question is this, have you thought much about this tension between, international exams, preparing people for maybe these, these international language speaking communities in universities or through immigration processes versus being very open-minded about how people speak?
Yeah. I do exactly what you did, I see this tension, right, between the international market, right? It's I even make this clearer to our students that there is even a market, right? An industry of tests, okay? They charge and students have to pass and they have to have the standard, follow the standard language in order to be evaluated correctly or adequately, okay, so on. So I say, okay, but this is the game. If you want to do this game, you have to follow it, right? But you have to be aware that doesn't mean that this is better than what you do, okay? But this is part of the game because of this idea of coloniality that we have in the world, right? So it is important to make people aware of things, right? Even it sounds strange to them, but I would do the same. Of course, that I wouldn't be able to do so well as you did because your English is much better, of course, much better according to the standards, right? But as I speak Brazilian English, and they would never come to me, to ask them to speak just as a native speaker. And I don't think I'm able. You see, this is what I mean. This is, I would say, better between quotation, be better according to this idea of native speakers, right? But I don't consider a person's language better than another person's language, right? I think people speak differently according to their communities, right? But there is a market that requires people to follow this idea of native, and it is a market, right? And if I work honestly, okay, with people and make them aware of this, okay, right? But I understand that to some purposes, for example, to some jobs in Brazil, they have to speak what is called excellent English, right? Without mistakes, right? Okay, I understand that some jobs require that, right? But for example, at the university, students have to know that there is a Caribbean English where people say, you is beautiful, for example, right? And I have to understand that, right? It's the same in the marginalized communities in Brazil. They speak a different kind of Portuguese, beautiful Portuguese, by the way, different, right? But there is a game to play to many people, right? But this game has to be clear to me, understand?
Perfect,
What do you
Professor.
think?
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. There's really, you touched upon it, is really because of economic. One thing I find really funny about the whole system, though, if you look in the criteria of both IELTS and TOEFL, two of the biggest exams going, a lot of it is in the public marking criteria, having an accent is okay, you know, but then at the same time, they want you to use the characteristics and certain phonemes of English. So I always find that to be a little bit contradictory. They're saying on one hand to make people feel better, oh no, it's okay, you speak how you want, but not like that. So I find it, you know, maybe worth challenging itself, as well as just telling the students it's a game, but also maybe, you know, the foundations of the criteria to be worth challenging too, possibly.
Yeah, that's right. Excellent reflection, Henry. Thank you very much for bringing it.
All right, nice. Thanks for your response as well. Thank you.
Okay, so now we give the microphone to Professor Mora.
Okay.
Walkyria,
Hello.
how are you?
Fine. How about you? So good to know that you're here.
Yeah,
At least you know that I'm informal, right? And I forgot to tell people.
Yeah, I wouldn't have missed it for the world. You know that. I mean, the moment I heard about it, I was like, okay, I'll be here. So I do have a question that it relates to your presentation, but it also relates to, let's say, the state of affairs of the field of literacy studies comparing Colombia and Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Brazil already has a point that you're kind of like your adulthood as a field, because you have, well, in a way that, I mean, you're far at you already got to the point that you've already started pushing at least some changes in curriculum and policy, at least through Proyecto Nacional de Letramentos, for example, the work that you and Lynn. We haven't gotten to that point yet, where we are, that the word literacy, as we understand it, it's becoming part of the curriculum. It's still it's still very much alfabetização rather than letramento in our case. That's where I'm going with that. And I've been following up with work for the past past decade, so to speak.
Yeah.
As our field is beginning to move into I would say it's adolescence, so to speak. I'm just wondering what lessons we could draw, what further lessons we could draw from the Brazilian experience. So, like, for example, literacy scholars in their own right, like Edison or Jose Vicente, were already through their research pushing the field forward. What lessons we can take from the Brazilian experiences? All the work that you have done, all the work that Terraz has done, the work of Ana Paula, the work of Andrea Matos, the work of the work of Claudia Rocha, the work of Barmaciel.
Right. Oh my goodness, you know everyone.
I could spend another 10 minutes saying I'm going to stop here just because I don't want to go naming names for the next 10 minutes. Yeah. But I think, the fact that I could mention so many names, I mean, that's an important thing. Because, and then when you start thinking of the case of Colombia, we still have the list is just beginning to appear. So in that sense, I would like to get your insights on that particular issue.
You know, it is first of all, I think that we had this this idea and this study and this notion about education, critique, and about languages and so on. And we started sharing these ideas with others. I think sharing is the first one. And then inviting others to build up projects with us. I think this is also a second step, I think. And little by little, we started disseminating those ideas. I still think it's still a drop in the ocean, to be honest. We are 30 universities in this huge Brazil, right? But 30, 34, let's say. But it doesn't matter. We've started, and that little by little, more and more people are going to have access to this kind of idea. But we don't think that we are going to change the whole country to follow all of these ideas, because those that do not agree, those who think differently, and there are other options are there. We are living with the difference as well, right? So it's just sharing and inviting people to build up projects and to have presentations with us. It takes time. I started in the 80s, as you know, right? And you were not born when I started doing.
Well, I was. Technically, I was, but I was probably in elementary school at the time.
So yeah, Linmaru and I have written some 2 texts, I think, already on that, because people asked us, how could you do critical education during dictatorship? I said, that was the challenge, right? We wouldn't make use of the word critical, for example. In my case, I decided that it should be called interpretive expansion or perspective expansion, instead of calling it critique, because they would give our names to the surveillance, I would say, the ideological surveillance in Brazil. So there were people just watching us, right? So we would just make use of some different terms for doing it, right? But of course, that I made some, I decided for some attitudes that were very, I would say, unexpected by people. For example, when we want to develop critique, we should offer the students, different ways of seeing what they already see, right? In any sense. So it could be in the religious area, or in the political area. It doesn't matter. One of the things I did with the students was studying a Colombian text called, oh my God, it was about a senator that fell in love with a 19-year-old girl. And oh my goodness, I have to show you this research. And
yeah, please.
They learned that in other countries, sorry?
Yeah, I would like to see it. I would like to see it.
I'll send it to you. So it's they were learning, and by that time it was, as you know, the idea in the story was to work on their own corruption. But by that time in Brazil, they didn't realize that meant corruption. They all gave emphasis to the romantic side of the story, that one a political, person, a congressman, fell in love with a young girl, for example, and her father needed some documents and decided to send the girl to him wearing a padlock, right? Saying, if you want her, I'll send you the key of the padlock, but you have to give me the documents that I need, for example. So the girl accepted, participated in this game, for example, and the idea was discussing this text in political terms, but they all saw the romantic side of the story and didn't find it there was corruption there. But because in Brazil we would have this every day, And I thought that they would realize that this was similar to what we all lived here, but they didn't see any relationship, right? They really mattered, you know, for love. That was the word, right? So it was interesting. So just showing them that there are discussing the other possibilities, for example, showing movies and stories and, you know, various things for them to see otherwise, right? For them to have contact with what is different as well, right? And to have an opportunity to think. So this was what I called interpretive expansion or perspective expansion instead of critique by the time. So finding ways, right, of making it work.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
Professora Walkyria, Professor Raul, and all the participants, thank you so much for this presentation. Eu gostaria de dar umas palavras de agradecimento para a senhora estar aqui, aceitar o convite. A verdade, em nome da Universidade Católica Luis Amigó, nós estamos muito agradecidos com você. Imagina. E especificamente, eu acho que a gente vai continuar fazendo esses processos juntos. Porque a ideia é justamente continuar fazendo esses processos entre a Colômbia e, obviamente, Brasil como irmãos. Muito obrigado para todos os participantes. A verdade, muito obrigado para você. Muito obrigado pela oportunidade e pelo seu tempo, a verdade, que é muito significativo.
Eu que agradeço muito pelo convite, pela oportunidade de dialogar com vocês, de contar sobre as experiências acadêmicas que eu tenho tido ao longo de décadas, né? É muito agradável saber que outras pessoas querem ouvir, né, sobre essas experiências, sobre esses estudos. Então, fico muito agradecida mesmo. Espero, sim, que a gente continue em contato e continue fortalecendo esses laços, né, entre as nossas universidades e nossos países. Tá bom?
Com
muito
certeza.
Obrigada.
Tá, o prazer é nosso. Tá? Thank you so much for everybody, and we finished in this moment.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
See
you
ya.
all. Okay, bye.
Thank you.